and welcome to From Harm to Home, the Westminster Violence Against Women and Girls Housing First podcast. My name is Louisa and I will be your host for this series, guiding you through the exciting and innovative world of the Westminster Violence Against Women and Girls Housing First project. The project provides housing and long-term wraparound support for women with experience of long-term homelessness, multiple disadvantage and any form of violence against women and girls in Westminster in London. We are making this podcast to showcase some of the amazing partners and people involved in this project, to create a platform for the women accessing the project to talk about their experiences and more generally to tell the world about how it works and what we have learnt along the way. In this first episode of the podcast, our wonderful multiple disadvantage and housing first lead at Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse, Hannah Brown. Hello, Hannah.
Hi Louisa.
Will be expertly guiding a potentially rambly conversation between myself and Victoria Aseervatham, Rough Sleeping Commissioner at Westminster City Council, about what Housing First is and how the project got started back in the olden days of 2017. Over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Louisa. Hi, Louisa and Victoria. Thanks for joining. So Victoria, Louisa helpfully introduced you earlier, but not herself. So Louisa is our podcast host and the Multiple Disadvantage and Homeless Programme Manager at Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse. So Standing Together are a charity that work nationally to build a coordinated community response to domestic abuse, and the Multiple Disadvantage and Homelessness Programme focuses on the response to survivors experiencing multiple disadvantage, which we understand as co-occurring experiences of homelessness, substance misuse, interpersonal violence, abuse and poor mental health. So Louisa, can you start off by telling us very briefly about the Housing First model, for those that don't know what Housing First is and what the Westminster VAWG Housing First project does?
Of course. Thanks, Hannah. So a little bit about what Housing First is for people that don't know. So Housing First is a model, I suppose, for housing and supporting people who are experiencing long-term or repeated homelessness, and who have experiences of multiple disadvantage. And as we said above, that's likely to be co-occurring experiences of homelessness, addiction, poor mental health, and we know particularly for women, experience of interpersonal violence and abuse, particularly domestic abuse. So Housing First really is the premise is that if you give somebody who fits this bill, so is experiencing multiple disadvantage, been homeless a very long time, maybe other service models haven't worked for them. So, for example, hostels and supported accommodation hasn't worked for them, but they can't be housed without quite a lot of support. It takes that person, gives them their own independent tenancy, and then provides wraparound support to enable that person to maintain that tenancy, because they would not be able to maintain it without that support, and I suppose gives them a bit of a platform to start working on other areas of their lives, maybe get a bit more involved with their physical health, going to hospital appointments, etc., or whatever it is they want to do. So it's a really, really holistic approach to support those, I suppose, most in need. In this country, it is a relatively small cohort that are going to have those particularly high needs and need that Housing First approach. It's very much, I think Housing First is very much only one way of tackling homelessness. It can't be seen as the all, as it sometimes is. Hostels have their place, lots of other homelessness models and structures have their place, and Housing First is definitely a part of that wider response to homelessness, I think. And it's something that we've done pretty successfully in this country. There are I can't remember the exact number, but there are a lot of services across the country, and the government committed funding to 3 national demonstration pilots as well. And excitingly, the new government are very keen on Housing First and are looking at potentially rolling it out going forward. So it's a really exciting thing to be involved in. I used to be a Housing First worker, so I'm very passionate about the model and the change it can make in people's lives. So the Westminster Violence Against Women and Girls Housing First project, which this podcast is all about, is a Housing First project specifically for women impacted by any form of violence against women and girls. So that could be domestic abuse, they could be being sexually exploited in some way, the whole range of different experiences of violence that these women are unfortunately exposed to. So it is for them. So it's women with experiences of long-term homelessness. Maybe they've been in and out of hostels, in and out of prison, on and off the streets for a long period of time. No other service models are really working for them. And what we do on the Westminster VAWG Housing First project is we provide those women with intensive support. So we don't at Standing Together, that's provided by Solace Women's Aid, a local women's specialist service provider, and we're going to be talking to them in a few podcast time. So they provide the support, and we have a partnership with lots of housing providers, and we're going to be talking to our housing providers in a few podcast time as well. And we have a partnership with them to provide the housing. So all of the women, the idea is they're provided with their own tenancy, and then Solace Women's Aid provide that wraparound support. And as I say, that support is not prescriptive. It's, you know, there to support them around whatever they want to work on at that time. So yeah, and there's lots of ways that I suppose needs to be a bit different for women, particularly women experiencing domestic abuse and other forms of violence against women and girls. And that's definitely something that we are going to look a bit more at as the project progresses. But in terms of what it does, I'm pretty sure that covers it. It's very much a way of housing these women, helping them to maintain that housing, but then just really providing them with that holistic support that they need to be able to start thinking about making changes in their lives.
For sure. Thanks, Louisa. That's a great summary of like what the project does really and the kind of value of it, what it adds, and also emphasising the importance of that different response to homelessness and how it's just part of a puzzle really in responding. Victoria, what led you to commission the project? I mean, you must have identified a real need in the borough to commissioning something like this. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So here in Westminster, we get the highest levels of rough sleeping. Oh, it's enormously challenging. The only slight silver lining is, I suppose, we're seeing with the numbers, you sort of seeing trends, and one of the things that we're really keen on is kind of getting people together auditing. So I've actually been here a really long time. So our audits for women started actually back in 2011. So every couple of years we're making sure we get hostels, outreach providers, drug and alcohol services together and think specifically about the needs of women, because it is different for women. Rough sleepers are in a minority, about 20%, and so often it can feel like services are geared around the needs of men. So we've been doing these audits, and the needs of this group, this revolving door group, incredibly high level of need, risk, and worry and concern about this group had been there. And through this audit and sort of mapping what we got, action planning, coming up with ideas, we'd done a couple of pilots, but we hadn't really hit this group squarely on. We had a pretty successful pilot in relation to older women with mental health needs, moving around boroughs, but we hadn't come up with something that really was holistically meeting the needs of this group. So I can't exactly remember how Louisa came into my life, but when she said, Victoria, what about a VAWG specialist housing first? I was like, oh yeah, I could see it quite instantly. And we had that kind of that background of thinking about the needs, thinking what could work.
Yeah.
How did we meet, Louisa?
How did we meet, Victoria? That is a very good question.
Was it one of those big meetings, those big Pan-London women's groupy meetings?
Yeah, I think so. I think Hannah's next question was about how I first got involved in the project. So maybe, sorry to butt in, Hannah, and allow you to ask your question. But yeah, I came in 2017. I got the role with Standing Together, and that's when we first met Victoria, I think, because we were thinking about I suppose it was the very, very, very pilot ideas for this project kind of came out then, when we were working with the Green Room, and which was a night shelter for women. For those for listeners, that a little bit of context around that in Westminster, that ran for a few years. And I, as I said earlier, had come from a frontline role doing Housing First support work for Camden Housing First, which was a St Mungo's delivered project. Before I worked for Camden Housing First, I was an independent domestic violence advisor, an IDVA for Solace Women's Aid, who are a women's specialist domestic abuse provider that provide a lot of services across London. They were a lot smaller back then when I worked for them. But yeah, so I suppose I first got involved with the project in 2017, and it was really great to meet Victoria and hear about some of the needs of the women in Westminster, because it sounded very similar to some of the women that I had supported in Housing First in Camden. So I suppose that's when I think first the idea for a women's specialist Housing First came into being, really. And I'd been up north. So back then in 2017, there were fewer Housing First projects across the country, and there was really only one or two, but one particular one that sticks in my mind for women, which was the Threshold Housing First service for female offenders. It was up north in Manchester, just outside of Manchester, and it supported 10 women with offending histories in that Housing First way, so housing them and providing intensive support. And I remember going to visit it and just being so struck at how incredible it was, really. So when I came into post in 2017, I met Victoria, and as I said, we've had Victoria talk about the audits. Victoria has always recognised the need to do more and find out more about this particular group of women, because their experiences are so disregarded, I suppose. So it was exciting to create something like this, really. I think it was an exciting time. Hannah, do you want to ask your next? Oh, go on, Victoria, come in.
Well, no, I was just going to resonate with so disregarded the stigma and the discrimination that this group faced. But then I can reflect on myself, though, and know there was a time when it almost felt too difficult, this incredibly risky group. How do you make a difference? How do you? And I felt, oh, this is out of the comfort zone. I haven't got the expertise to do commissioning for this group. But turns out, yeah, so meeting you was incredibly beneficial because I could see you were joining up these two valleys of knowledge, the valleys of knowledge around homelessness outreach, and the valleys of knowledge around domestic abuse. I was incredibly grateful to meet you. But yeah, absolutely, such for me the fuel for the work is that injustice, really. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So what were kind of the key considerations in the setup period of the first year of the project?
So I think first of all was finding, I think one of the more tricky things was finding the right provider to deliver the support. And then of course, one of the most tricky things for all Housing First service is actually sourcing the housing. So in the setup period, I suppose at Standing Together, we really focused on trying to put a bit of a structure in place for the housing. So we Standing Together, we have had and have continued to have good relationships with housing providers through our Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance work and accreditation scheme, and we approached Peabody, who approached a few other providers in London, and brought them together and basically pitched the idea for the project and asked if they would be willing to provide flats for housing units for it. And they kind of went for it because it was a small ask at first. Most Housing First projects start off small as a pilot, and we were aiming to support just 10 women in that first year. So that meant a really small ask on flats. And yeah, they went for it. And that's when we set up our housing partnership, which we continue to coordinate to this day. I say we, you, Hannah. Hannah is actually our multiple disadvantage and Housing First lead at Standing Together, and she does an absolutely wonderful job of coordinating the housing partnership. And you're going to hear all from Hannah about the amazing work she does on that in a few podcast time. But way back in the day in 2017, we set up the seed for that, I suppose. The first 5 housing providers came on board. We put together a service level agreement, and kind of set up how people would be nominated for houses and for flats and stuff. So that was one thing that went on. And then there was quite, I'm going to bring Victoria in here because, as I say, getting the right support provider was very important, wasn't it, Victoria?
Yeah, we did a competitive procurement approach. There was a lot of interest. I think we got 6 bids in off the top of my head. From a range of women's specialist organisations and wider, sort of thinking about the specification, we built that together, didn't we? But thrilled with the work that Solace have done. Yeah, I think there are a lot of benefits of having a specific women's specialist organisation.
Definitely. We were really pleased that Solace Women's Aid, women's specialist organisation, came in to do that, to do the support element of the project, and they're still working with the project to this day. I think they have a lot of services now that really focus on survivors who experience multiple disadvantage, and I think that's a real area of specialism for them. It was also really exciting because Housing First is mainly a model that predominantly has sat in the housing and homelessness sector. So for a specialist women's provider to be actually involved in a project and doing that Housing First support, which is so different, and I can tell you now, having done both, being a Housing First worker is about 1 million miles away from being an INFA. There are lots of crossovers, but you need also quite a lot of different skills. So I think for them it was quite a big learning curve about how to do that. But the difference that it makes for a women's housing first project to have a specialist women's provider providing that support, I think is really key. So I think those were probably the key considerations in that setup period, and in that first year when 10 women were supported.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the real big things is you started off small and then it's built so much in the last 5 years now. So yeah, it's really like it's gone from 10 women, 2 workers to 50 women, 8 workers. So it's really expanded. Kind of following on from that, Victoria, how do you kind of see the Westminster Violence Against Women and Girls Housing First services different from other housing first services?
Yeah. Solace are definitely bringing that extra dimension to it. I think women's needs are different. The gendered nature of trauma, how the deep understanding of trauma-informed work. That's what I see from the Solace workers. Really, so many of the women you really from childhood would experience so much damage through relationships, and then it's them. Those good, kind, compassionate, tenacious, reliable relationships are helping women kind of heal and trust again. Obviously, that I suppose what I see from them is that dogged pursuit of understanding. Even when women with all that support kind of are in quite negative cycles, making decisions, just think, oh no, don't do that, don't let him in, don't do that, oh, don't go back to that one, don't find another person. But always finding ways to understand it, put it in context, educate the other workers, hang in there for women. It's so deeply impressive. Challenging, the stigma and discrimination like that happens again and again across services. Obviously having the domestic abuse specialism, there's some technical stuff. It makes a huge difference. They're up on the molestation orders and DV. Well, I don't even know the technical language myself. Yeah, so it adds a huge benefit. Yeah, because we also commission someone goes to do housing first, but yes, no, I see the difference of that gendered approach. Absolutely.
Brilliant, thanks, Victoria. And Louisa, are you aware of many other housing first projects like this?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I think so when I first started this role in 2017, I think there were 2. Now there are definitely more than 6. I think maybe upwards of 10. So I think local areas are really starting to realise how women's needs are different, and how particularly in the homelessness response, I think areas are starting to understand that you're not going to be able to address or end homelessness for women if you use a one-size-fits-all approach for all homelessness. And I think, Victoria talks earlier about the audits that she did. We now have a national women's census, which is incredible. I think we could definitely go on to talk about that. But we now have a women's census to, try and shine a light on the actual levels of women's rough sleeping that are not captured in kind of spot counts. So yeah, I think with that awareness, more services for particularly for women are popping up. I know that there's a housing first for women involved in the sex industry in Leeds that is run by a great organisation called Basis. I know of a few other projects like this, but I think we're really proud of what we've achieved with this project. It's very unique in a few ways. I think the way we do our housing with our housing partnership and the way that got started is really special, actually. And we'll definitely talk more about that as we go through this podcast series. But yeah, I think all in all, it's been quite a journey, and I think I'm really looking forward over this podcast series, I suppose, to reflecting more on some of the different aspects of it.
Louisa and Victoria, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you for listening, and see you for the next episode, where we'll be talking with Standing Together's own Hannah Brown about the vital role housing coordination plays in the Westminster VAWG Housing First project. If you would like to find out more about the Westminster VAWG Housing First project, please visit our website at www.standingtogether.org.uk. This podcast is written by me, Louisa Steele, and produced and edited by the amazing Holly Ringrose. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe, leave a rating and review. To stay up to date with the podcast, you can follow us on the Multiple Disadvantage and Homelessness team channel on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening.